Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Distracted Driving Coalition webinar, Distracted Driving Prevalence Data Sources, Challenges, and Technological Solutions. The webinar is hosted by the National Transportation Safety Board, a member of the coalition, and this webinar will last approximately an hour and a half. Now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to the NTSB Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg for some opening remarks. Vice Chairman?
Thank you, Nicholas, and thanks to all of our panelists for joining us today. Today's webinar will be a discussion of a new product of the NDDC released at the end of 2022. As Nicholas has stated, it's a bit of a tongue twister: Distracted Driving Prevalence Data, Sources, Challenges, and Technological Solutions. With a title like that, it has to be good. We have an outstanding panel today, and many of the people who helped to write this program are part of our panelists. So this was sorely needed to answer the typical questions that many elected officials ask, and others as well. Is distracted driving really a problem? The answer is a resounding yes. When the coalition was first formed in 2021, we realized that by creating a single source for distracted driving statistics, we could do a number of things. First, each group within the coalition could focus on what it did best. Second, by presenting the data together, we could give some context as to why there were differences among available data sources, which can be a source of confusion. And finally, we could identify where there are data gaps that need to be addressed. This report is an example of the synergy we envisioned by creating the NDDC. It looks at distracted driving by examining crash data, arrests and convictions, naturalistic driving data, and self-reporting by the drivers themselves. It was produced by NDDC members, including nonprofits, universities, insurance companies, and the tech community. This is a great first step. The study highlights how much distracted driving is happening on our highways, which is a lot. It shows where additional information is needed and identifies some of the ways that technology can help to fill those data gaps. Now, deaths and injuries are recorded in data tables, but we feel them at the dinner table. Far too many of the people watching, and unfortunately more this year, will know the pain of losing a loved one or seeing them seriously injured. It didn't have to happen. These crashes are not accidents. They are completely preventable. The data is available today to show distractions' outsized contribution to our nation's horrendous driving record. And that's what's needed to implement life-saving changes for education and to change the laws. National Distracted Driving Awareness Month begins in April. What better time to spread the awareness about a known state of the problem? And this information will be available to everyone who's fighting distracted driving. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists to talk about what we know today about distracted driving and what we would like to know in the future. Nicholas, back to you, sir.
Thank you, Vice Chairman, and thanks to our panelists for joining us. I'm going to do a lightning round of panelists' introduction, but their full bios are in the chat if you want to know more about them. We will hear first from Robin Robertson, President and CEO of Traffic Injury Research Foundation, or TIRF. Then we'll turn it over to Dr. Charlie Clower, Research Scientist and Training System Lead, Division of Vehicle, Driver and Safety System at Virginia Tech Transportation Institute. We will then hear from Josh Graver, PhD, founder of Path Zero AI, a machine learning company with a mission of helping end distracted driving and make our world roads safer and more equitable. And our final panelist will be Corey Winteruffage, Chief Revenue Officer for NoCell Technologies, LLC. Together, they will provide insights into the prevalence of distracted driving based on crash data, arrest and conviction data, naturalist driving data, and self-report data. After each panelist have presented. We'll take a few questions. So please, if you have questions, submit them into the chat box. So without further ado, let me turn it over to our first panelist, Robin Robertson. Robin, take it away.
Great. Thanks very much, Nick. And thanks very much to the Vice Chairman for his leadership with the coalition and really bringing the group together to make this work possible. So I'm pleased to be able to chair this. And I had a tremendous group of colleagues on the subcommittee who worked on this particular paper, including one of my own staff, Steve Brown, and several others who are joining us. So thanks to everyone for their contribution. Let me go to slideshow. So many things to click through. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and the coalition and jump right into the different types of data. So for those of you who've not heard of the Traffic Injury Research Foundation, we are an independent road safety research institute and registered charity. We focus primarily on road user behavior, but also look at other contributors to road crashes. And this year we are celebrating our 60th year. And also the coalition, more than 50 members and stakeholder organizations representing the whole spectrum of sectors. And really, everyone is concerned about the distracted driving issue. So we came together to accelerate progress in addressing the problem, to create a culture of more attentive drivers, and really focus on interventions and solutions. So I'm pleased we have some representatives from the technology industry who are able to join us today to talk about some of those solutions. So prevalence is important because if we can't show it's a problem, then we can't focus attention and resources on fixing it. So for a number of years now, distraction's been recognized as a key issue on the roads. There have been very general estimates of 25 to 30% of road crashes fatals involved distraction as a contributing factor. But it's very difficult to measure. We have several data sources which provide us with different windows on the problem, but not really a complete solution. So as I said, it's very important to measure prevalence, which is why this is a key piece coming out of the coalition, because we need to show it's a problem to inspire that leadership and that coordinated action, to explore new technologies and solutions, but also to pursue research to identify effective interventions. So lots of different data sources are going to be discussed today. I'm going to talk about some of them. I'm pleased that Charlie's here to talk about the naturalistic driving data. And then we have Corey to talk about our cell phone data, and Josh to talk about some of the new data from camera technologies, which really provide new insights into the magnitude of the problem. So most of you are familiar with the fatality analysis reporting system and the fatal crash data coming out of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration that's reported by states. And there is a number of key factors that are important that are reported in there routinely. And that's true in many countries as well. We have some fatal crash data looking at this particular problem. And it's really only been in the last decade or so where we've seen strong improvements in collecting fatal crash data and looking at different types of distractions. If you look at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, we've seen in the last several years, more than 3,000 people are killed. It's estimated about 8% of fatal crashes and 14% of injury crashes involve distraction. And I think Charlie's also going to talk a little bit about some new tools to look at the magnitude of the problem. In Canada, we've also made a lot of progress to better collect distracted driving data, and we've seen improvements across the board, but our data is showing us approximately 1 in 4 fatal crashes does involve distraction. So in Canada, we talk about the fatal 4 factors in road crashes because distraction is really comparable in size to our impaired driving and our speeding problems, which are key contributors. Some of the limitations, obviously, of collision data are drivers who survive are not going to spontaneously say, wow, I was distracted. and volunteer that information. There may not be witnesses or passengers in the vehicle who can provide information to police. And it's very difficult to ascertain what a driver was doing at the time of a collision for law enforcement after the fact. So unlike speeding and impairment, where we have very clear-cut metrics, you're either speeding or you aren't, you're impaired or you aren't. When it comes to distraction, it's less clear-cut, and it's very difficult to identify it as a factor in fatal crash data for that reason. Another important source that provides a window is citation and conviction data. But what we've seen, not just with distraction, but other road safety issues, is sometimes arrest and conviction data tells us more about enforcement resources and court resources than it tells us about the prevalence of the problem. So there are some sources of data that are available. The Insurance Institute study that was done in 2022 looking at the effectiveness of laws in a couple of experimental states as well as control states used arrest and conviction data. So that study contained some of this information. And generally what was reported is that there were declining trends in arrest and conviction data up until laws were changed. And that's really a common pattern. We see improvements in laws, we see more intensity in terms of the enforcement of those laws, and then it wanes. So it's a little bit of a cycle. So conviction and arrest data tell us something important, but certainly don't give us a complete picture of the problem. Important limitations of these data, as I said, law enforcement across the country have many priorities, and distracted driving is just one piece of road safety, which is one piece of many, many competing resources. And then there's also the ability of officers to safely detect other drivers who are distracted. And then certainly court cases, if you've watched the media, you've no doubt followed some of these cases with interest where we've had competing decisions for similar cases with different outcomes. You have very creative excuses from drivers, and the wording of the law is an important factor, again, showing in the IHS study for arrests and convictions. Naturalistic driving data, as I said, Charlie's going to talk a little bit about this. Suffice it to say, these studies look at instrumented vehicles and measure collisions, near misses, and sudden steering or braking episodes. So I'm going to leave it there. And Charlie will also talk about some of the limitations of these data as well. But the one small study I did want to highlight, which was interesting, was from one of our authors, Dan Trainer. At Pulse Labs, they did a small micro study of 26 drivers, and they had about 8.5 hours of driving time. So really a very small group of drivers in fairly modern and newer vehicles, but it basically showed that about 14% of their time they were distracted while they were driving, and 2/3 of those distractions were communications related. So roadside and observational studies. These studies are more expensive and more complex to do. And again, important safety issues, observing drivers on the road, particularly when they're moving at speed. So NHTSA funded some enforcement demonstration projects to look at what are some of the better tools or better strategies for law enforcement to detect distracted drivers. And then there was a study done by Preußer, by Neil Chowdhury and his colleagues in 2018 in Virginia, which replicated a study in 2014 in Northern Virginia, where they were observing secondary behaviors on the roadside from either moving or stopped vehicles. And what was interesting was that cell phone use was frequently observed, and not surprisingly, but other non-cell phone secondary behaviors were more prevalent. So interesting insights coming out of observational data. Again, some of the limitations, we don't do these types of studies very often simply because they are expensive. There's a lot of logistics, and it gives you a point in time measurement, which may or may not be generalizable across a broader audience or a broader span of time. It's very difficult to observe drivers, particularly at night and at highway speed. And I think Josh is going to talk about some of those opportunities to improve some of that measuring. And then again, that limited point in time. There are also telephone and online self-report surveys which provide us insight into the magnitude of the problem. And there have been a lot of different types of surveys done. So there's general population surveys looking at attitudes, knowledge, and self-reported behavior. And NHTSA has done a number of these studies. There's also the Traffic Safety Culture Index study that's been led by the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety, which looks at self-reported behaviors, but then also perceived danger and risk of apprehension and support for laws. There are also specialized surveys done on target populations, such as young drivers and commercial vehicle drivers. And these are important studies as well, because they represent different types of risks. So young drivers are, most at risk on the road because of age and inexperience. And then commercial vehicle drivers, their exposure is much greater, and they have a lot of communication technologies in their vehicle, and the industry is working to ensure that their drivers aren't distracted by managing those communications. But these are high-risk populations, and for that reason, having specialized surveys about them is equally important. Some of the key results coming out of self-report surveys and online surveys are actually fairly consistent. There's the e-survey of road user attitudes, which is done in 25 countries actually around the world, including Canada and including the US. And the data from 2015 to 2016, which was a rather large sample, revealed that almost 50% of US drivers had driven and talked on a handheld phone at least once in the past 12 months. More recent data in 2019 from the AAA FTS showed that 43% admitted to talking on a handheld at least once in the past 30 days. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety in 2021 also did a large survey looking specifically at this issue as another subcommittee of the National Distracted Driving Coalition. And it involved more than 2,000 drivers. And again, a significant portion admitted to performing one or more distracting activities on most or every drive in the last 30 days. I think that was 2/3, and half said that they performed at least one device-based task. So particularly when we're asking drivers in the last 30 days, what have you done? You can see that the prevalence is quite high. There's also the Travelers Index, which is another survey of about 1,000 drivers, which showed 56% had read a text message or an email. And 27% had updated or checked their social media. So lots of evidence that the magnitude of the problem certainly warrants concern. And what's more interesting is when you look at the online and the survey data, some of the limitations of it. So there's been some work done where they've matched naturalistic driving data with survey data to see if people will accurately admit what they're doing in the vehicle and whether or not they're distracted at the time of an incident when it occurs. So again, limited evidence, but it suggested about 70% of drivers would not admit to being distracted because of the stigma. So there's clearly a lot of stigma associated with this issue. But again, it shows you some of the gaps that we're seeing with some of these different data sources and how you have to have a good holistic understanding of what those data sources represent and what they don't in order to really talk about the size of the problem. The limitations of telephone surveys and online surveys are very well known, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. Then there's also in-person surveys. So the most notable one is done by the Centers for Disease Control every other year, looking at high school age students. That's the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and it's administered in person. So there's a small number of questions which do look at distracted driving and specifically texting and emailing while driving. And the 2019 results showed that among the 60% of respondents who had driven in the last 30 days, a significant chunk of them, I think it's like 39%, there we go, 39% had texted or emailed at least once. So these are your very young, high-risk drivers. So again, some insight into the problem, but we still need more. Lastly, cell phone user data, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because Corey's going to talk about this issue as well. But again, looking at what people are doing on their phones while they're driving is really an important resource. And the Cambridge Mobile Telematics study showed that the 10% most distracted drivers had loss frequencies 2.2 times greater than the 10% of least distracted drivers. So the consequences are certainly real. So in a nutshell, it's really important that we work hard to improve the collection of distraction-related data. We need to do that to ensure that there is a political attention and leadership to pursue technologies, to improve legislation, and to undertake research to accelerate our progress eliminating this problem. What's equally important in terms of data collection is being able to differentiate between who are your occasional distracted drivers versus who are your persistent distracted drivers. And I think that's really important because messaging needs to be targeted and tailored. So we need much better understanding of our audience in order to undertake really solid prevention work. And then, of course, the opportunities for technology to augment the data we have and give us more insight to answer some of those questions and inform legislation and ultimately prevent collisions is incredibly important. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing my screen. And I don't know if there's a minute or two for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. Appreciate it. One of the questions that was asked, can we access this recording after the session? Yes, we will prepare the recording and send it out to all of the panelists, not the panelists, to everyone here on the session, including the general public. One question I did have that came in, some states include Kansas, Massachusetts, and Georgia have done observational surveys of distracted driving in connection with the required NOPA survey of restraint use. Is there a need for this type of study, and would it benefit from standardized study design?
So I think making comparisons across data sets is important. And I know in Canada, the seatbelt use surveys that we've historically done have been replaced by distracted driving surveys. These aren't kinds of surveys that you would really necessarily do every year, but it is important to do them regularly to make sure that whether things are staying the same, whether things are changing. So this is an important data source. I think it needs to be applied routinely so that we have consistent data. And I think increasing kind of how those metrics and how those studies are done is important. We've certainly seen that with surveys where there's been more consistency and continuity across questionnaires to ask similar questions so we can make comparisons among those data sources.
All right, thank you, Robin. I think up next is Charlie, but I think Charlie's having a couple technical issues. So if Charlie's not available, we can turn it over to Josh.
All right, can everyone see those okay? Give me a thumbs up. Hi, my name's Josh Graver. I'm the founder of PathZero.ai. We're a machine learning company. Our mission is to end distracted driving and make the world's roads safer and more equitable. We're based in Boston, out of MIT. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about a new technology for gathering prevalence data and observing distracted driving. Robin hinted at it. This would be a complement or useful in roadside and observational studies. Just a brief background about myself. I have a PhD in mechanical and aerospace engineering. Most of my background is in autonomous vehicles and robotics. And I actually have a personal connection and longtime interest in roadway safety. When I was a kid growing up in New York City, I was in a serious car crash involving a red light runner. My mom was driving me in the city and someone ran a red light and our car was flipped over. Both cars were destroyed. Thankfully, everyone survived with minor injuries, but that led to a real long-term interest in road safety. Robin already hinted at one of the challenges with roadside and observational studies and the challenge overall with gathering data on the prevalence of distracted driving. So one type of study essentially involves people standing at the roadside, watching cars go by and trying to determine, was that driver holding a phone, and conducting counts of how many drivers, what type of distraction, et cetera. And there's a number of difficulties with these types of studies. They're expensive. You generally can't do them at night because people can't see into the cars at night. They're almost impossible to do at highway speeds. It's very difficult to get even an idea of how many people are in a car, let alone determine whether a driver is holding a phone when they're going by at 60, 80 miles an hour. There's also a lot of problems with visibility in terms of where can you stand safely and see into a car and observe whether a driver is distracted. Another issue related to that is drivers will often seek to conceal their phone use, depending on what state they're in. Using a phone may be a primary violation. And so you'll often see that instead of holding their phones up, drivers will kind of keep them down in their lap or next to their legs. So there is, though, a really nice, exciting new technology that can provide a solution to a lot of these problems, and that's smart cameras. So that's smart cameras that use machine learning and new technologies and image processing that can be placed on an overpass or a gantry or on a roadside trailer or other mobile unit. And so they're outside the car and they can scan passing cars, image each driver, and determine which drivers are, for example, holding a telephone or holding a phone, eating, smoking. What's nice about this is that it has, you can do it at high speeds, you can do it 24/7, and then you can also gather that larger data set for further analysis later. So just to give you an idea of what this process looks like, here you can see a smart camera. This one is illustrated at the roadside. Generally, you want them to have a clear view of the windshield. That's the best view to get for driver and determining distraction. In the center, this is an actual image taken with our equipment and processed with our technology. So you can see each car that goes by on this lane gets scanned and identified, and then the driver is identified and it's determined this particular driver is holding a cell phone, so clearly distracted. To give you an idea of potential for camera placement, there's a lot of flexibility in how you might deploy this type of system. You could have it in a fixed camera, which is mounted on a gantryway or an overpass. For the purposes of a brief study, you might use a portable camera that you can bring from place to place and position on overpasses. You could put it on a trailer so that you can tow it from place to place. You can see on the right, there's a trailer with a boom that holds the camera up at a good viewing angle. So there's a lot of interesting applications. It's a very flexible technology. What you're really looking for is you probably want to study a variety of roads. Where's a safe place to locate this? But there's a lot of locations where an observational study done by people standing on the road might be inaccessible, but you could put a camera there. Here's some more examples, just to give you an idea of how the technology works or the concept of what it's doing. All of these are actual images, again, gathered by our equipment of real cars on a highway near Boston. Every car that goes by gets detected. That triggers an imaging process. Then you can automatically process the image using state-of-the-art machine learning. Essentially, what this means is instead of having to have people go through the tens of thousands of images you would gather each day for even a single lane on a highway, you can automatically process them. So it's much faster, much more efficient. Each of these drivers, the system accurately detected that they were holding a phone. You could imagine you might also look at things like a driver's pose, or are they smoking or eating? Here's some key advantages. I touched on some of these already. One is that you can measure the prevalence of distraction across an entire driver population. So that's a limitation of some other study methods. This one can be really complementary to those. So you could imagine setting up cameras across an entire highway, measuring things on a variety of road types. Another thing that you can do that you can't do with other methods is day and night operation. So with modern camera technology, night vision cameras, et cetera, you can get very high quality images regardless of the weather at night, et cetera. You'd expect this technology is also scalable and cost effective. So you could install a camera at reasonable cost and then have it there for a month's long study. That would be very straightforward. Another thing is that unlike some other types of studies, you don't have to enroll a large panel of drivers. You don't have to install equipment inside cars. One thing that I think would be really interesting would be using this technology to measure the impact of other interventions, for example, an educational campaign or a change in distracted driving laws in a given location or high visibility enforcement efforts. You could say, all right, we're going to put out a set of these cameras. We're going to start conducting smart camera surveys to collect data several months ahead of the start of one of these campaigns, and then look at change in distraction over time. You can also measure seatbelt use, and you could do that in the same study. I know Robin mentioned seatbelt studies. So there's that, I think, again, goes to the economies of scale. Some things to consider about using something like this is it's a vision-based system, right? So it's very, very accurate in determining things that you can see in a photograph. So you can think about, if I had an image of the driver, what could I determine? The system can also complement and enable human review. So while we're talking about doing an automated processing of these images, there is space for saving your images, having researchers review them as you're doing the study, making adjustments. But if you can't detect something visually, clearly you're not going to get it with this system. So something like a hands-free phone call, that's a source of distraction that you wouldn't be able to observe. The other thing to think about is that while you're surveying the entire population, you're observing them at a point in time and space. So for each, you identify a road that you want to survey, you put out cameras above that road, you're getting the entire population that passes that place at the time they pass it. But you're not getting, say, days-long observations on a single driver. So again, I think this can really complement some of the other systems that we're going to be discussing today. Another thing that we're really interested in is, and this is where the audience comes in, is the potential to use existing installed cameras. So things like toll plaza cameras or toll gantry cameras. Some of these systems already are imaging cars. For example, I know a friend who got a ticket for running a toll, and it had a very clear image of the driver. There's others that are recording license plates, etc. So if you are with a transportation agency or a highway agency and you know that you already have cameras that may be gathering adequate imagery, those could be used in a potential study to determine distracted driving prevalence. So if you happen to be in that position, please reach out to us. We'd be very interested in seeing if we could implement this technology. Just talking about how deployment of these cameras might work, because it's an advanced technology, it works, it's proven, but it's not the type of camera, for example, with like a traffic camera, where a state transportation agency will simply buy the hardware, install it, and use it themselves. There is a certain level of expertise needed to deploy and maintain operations of this type of system, mainly because the image processing is complex. So what would typically happen would be a government agency or highway authority or other end user would contract with a system operator like Path0 AI or another camera company to do the deployment and operation of the system. And then they would jointly manage the data and process the information at the end. So this is a new technology. It works. There's several companies that have demonstrated successful on-road deployments in a couple of different locations. We've done a number of things in Boston. There's another company called AccuSensus that has successfully deployed this system in Australia and is doing some demonstrations in the United States. There's a couple of other companies working on this in Europe. So this is a real technology. This is not science fiction. What's still to come is widespread deployment for the purposes of gathering prevalence data and publication of that information. And I think that's going to come within the next year or two. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, please reach out to me. I'll pause for questions if there are any, and then we'll hand it off to the next speaker. So thank you very much.
Hey, Josh, I think what we're going to do is go ahead and proceed into Charlie's presentation and then come back to some of the questions, given that Charlie has to jump off at the top of the hour, 2:00. So Charlie, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Nick. I thank you, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I'm going to talk about the lessons that we have learned from naturalistic driving studies based on prevalence specifically. I'm going to briefly touch on risk because those are really two key components of naturalistic data that we can talk about together. And then I'm going to have Larry Blinko come on and talk about a project that we worked together on. Larry is the lead author on a NTSB technical report where he took crash data and merged it with naturalistic data to also arrive at prevalence numbers. So with that, I'm going to kind of dive into my presentation here. So first of all, transportation researchers have a wide variety of different toolboxes or tools in their toolbox to look at different types of distracted driving. We have experimental studies as well as observational and crash databases, all of which give us slightly different information about the crash data problem. Experimental studies are very controlled, but they really allow us to understand what secondary task engagement or driver distraction, how that actually may impair, or how it may impact driving performance in a wide variety of different ways. Observational studies, like Robin talked about, they have been able to help us kind of understand how many or how frequently drivers are engaging in a variety of tasks. This has been focused a lot on handheld use specifically. And crash databases are excellent sources of what actually happens during or at a crash, but it's very difficult to record distraction after the fact. So we really need a much better sense of prevalence of how often distracted driving is occurring and under what conditions. So one way to do this is to use naturalistic driving studies. And I'm going to back up a little bit and kind of talk about what do we really mean by a naturalistic driving study. So in naturalistic driving studies, we instrument participants, typically their own vehicles, with data acquisition systems where we can monitor not only the driver themselves, but also the forward roadway and the environment around the vehicle. And we also have sensors on board. So we know exactly how fast that driver is going, how hard they're braking, how fast they're cornering, et cetera. And we use unobtrusive instrumentation. So it's not, obvious to everyone that this is happening, but it does provide really detailed pre-crash information, real life behaviors of drivers who are on their daily commutes under their normal daily pressures, not contrived situations in an experiment. And the final component of these studies is a very, very rich database, not only of questionnaire and survey data, so we really understand these participants, but also driving performance and driver behavior in the seconds leading up to crashes, as well as driver behavior when safety critical events are not occurring at all. So one particular study that is has been really important in this assessment of distracted driving and prevalence and risk was the second Strategic Highway Research Program Naturalistic Driving Study. This is affectionately referred to as SHARP-2 NDS. This was the largest naturalistic driving study that has been ever undertaken, and these data are publicly available. If you go to Insight, SHARP-2 Insight, there is a website there that can instruct you on how to obtain these data. But this was the largest naturalistic driving study ever undertaken. There were 3,500 drivers in 6 data collection sites across the United States. We collected data on 5 million trips, and we had collected up to 2 years of continuous driving performance and driver behavior data on all 3,500 of these drivers. Within these data, we found probably close to 2,000 crashes now, about 4,000 near crashes, but we also reduced 20,000 baseline events where there is no safety critical event occurring. It's simply a random baseline event stratified by hours traveled, so that we are collecting these baselines, more baselines for those drivers who drove a lot and less on drivers who drove less. And what that allows us to do is really assess not only the prevalence of driver behavior and estimate various things like texting, dialing, browsing on their cell phone. So because of the video camera data that we have, we can be very precise in prevalence of what drivers are doing at any given moment in time. These types of studies are huge logistical challenges. And while it is extraordinarily powerful and useful data, these studies are very expensive. They can really only be done every so often. And so these data were collected in 2010 to 2013. And so they're already 10 years old. And we will need additional naturalistic driving studies to really continue to assess driver behavior as we move forward. So there are 2 publications that we will be talking about today. One is the Dingus article that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science. And then another study that my good colleague and friend Feng Guo and I published in the International Journal of Epidemiology. And I'm going to focus on this second one primarily because we looked at prevalence and risk of secondary task engagement on drivers of different age groups. So this is the percent of control segments. So we are using those 20,000 control segments to estimate prevalence of a wide variety of different secondary tasks. So overall distraction, this is any time a driver is engaging in anything other than driving while they are alert and they are not drowsy and they are not impaired in any way, shape, or form. And so what you will see is that over 50% of the time, 16 to 20-year-olds, 21 to 29-year-olds, 30 to 64-year-olds are engaging in some sort of secondary task. Whereas 65-year-olds, they were engaging in about 40% of these baseline epochs. So engaging in some type of secondary task is quite frequent. When we look at overall cell phone use, we're closer to 10% of these control segments, and only for the 2 youngest age groups. And cell phone visual manual tasks, which are those types of tasks that are browsing, dialing, texting, those types of tasks are around 5 and 7% for the youngest drivers, lower for 30 to 64-year-olds, and nearly non-existent for the 65-year-olds. Cell phone talking is, roughly 5% for the 21 to 29-year-olds, but much less than that for the other age groups. Other types of tasks are also important to look at in this when we're looking at all kinds of different types of behaviors. So one thing to notice is that this y-axis has changed a little bit. This is 100%. I've dropped it down to 50 just so that we can kind of see what some of these percentages are, because engaging in drinking or eating tasks, external distraction where someone is tracking something outside the vehicle, and engaging in the infotainment center, radio, HVAC, these types of tasks are done much less frequently than many other tasks. Interacting with passenger, however, is roughly around 15 to 18% of our baseline or of our control segments. So we interact with passengers quite a bit. Complementary to prevalence. So prevalence is a very important indicator, and it's a really important one, as Robin pointed out, to really be able to measure how big of a problem is driver distraction. But complementary to that is crash risk. So not only how often are people engaging, but how often are people engaging when that behavior is then affiliated or associated with some sort of a crash. And so for overall distraction, and for these 4 age groups, we're seeing that it's roughly around 2 to 3% of, the risk of when drivers are engaging in secondary tasks is 2 to 3 times that of an alert driver. So we are seeing increases in crash risk for just any type of secondary task. But overall cell phone use, the risk of engaging in cell phone tasks, visual manual cell phone tasks are even slightly higher. So not only do we see fairly high prevalence for these types of behaviors, we're also seeing extremely high risk for these types of behaviors. And that's what makes these the most important. That's what makes these more important than other types of tasks. When we look at other behaviors for the less prevalent tasks, we are seeing very high odds ratios and high risk levels, but the prevalence of those tasks are much less, which is why we are concerned about wireless device use. Interacting with passenger also increased risk, but only for the youngest age group. Interacting with passenger did not increase crash risk for any of the other older age groups. And our 21 to 29-year-olds had their highest risk on many of those secondary tasks, and actually higher than our youngest drivers. So that's another component to this analysis, and that we're also seeing in more recent data, where it's not just our 16 and 17-year-old drivers that really have high crash risks, but also prevalence of secondary task engagement. Our 20-year-olds are still engaging and still have very high risk, crash risk. So we feel like this is a trend that is concerning. So to just kind of conclude this, there are many types of secondary tasks that that drivers engage in, that we need to not only be concerned about prevalence, but we also need to be concerned about risk. And wireless devices have a fairly high prevalence, but also an extremely high risk. Risk of crash occurrence for all drivers, especially novice drivers, is highest for those types of tasks that require the driver's eyes to be off the forward roadway. And so those are the types of tasks that we really are concerned about as traffic safety professionals. And those are the ones we would like to see prevalence drop. And we believe that this research supports handheld device bans for drivers of all ages, especially novice drivers. All right. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to Larry Blinko to talk about the latest NTSB technical report that also talks about the impact of distracted driving on our nation's roadways. Larry?
Thank you, Charlie. So about every 8 to 10 years, NTSB re-examines the societal impact of motor vehicle crashes. We attempt to quantify it in dollar terms as well as incidents. And as part of that analysis, we look specifically at distraction. In past years, we have used police-reported distraction as a basis for that. And as an example, in the year we examined for this report, 2019, police were reporting about 9% for fatalities and about 15% for others. This year, we decided to take a different tact, and we partnered with VTTI to look at Sharp-2 data to come up with these estimates. Next slide. So the study that Charlie mentioned, the Dingus study, was the first study to examine distraction using Sharp-2 data for crashes, basically. And we looked at that study, and we were thinking of using that study as a basis for it, but we determined that there were a few problems with it that wouldn't work out as a national estimate that we were applying. So we contacted VTTI and we came up with a plan to modify the study in a few key ways. The 2016 study compared distraction to perfect driving. We were interested in seeing it compared to real on-road, real-world driving conditions and driving behaviors. It also oversampled old and young drivers, which was fine for the, they had a real good reason for doing that in the 2016 study, but we wanted to be able to have a study that had representative age groups on a nationwide basis. So we revised the study to measure impact of distraction against real-world driving behaviors and to allow for national representative driver age incidents. The goal was a nationally representative estimate of distraction crash causation. Next. So in addition to redesigning the study to reflect a real-world baseline, we separated the study into groups. We examined specific age groups. This would enable us to adjust the results to be nationally representative of driving ages on U.S. roadways. So we combined this information with VMT data by age groups so that we could get a properly weighted age sample. We also looked at categories of distraction to examine whether general types of distraction were more harmful than others. We looked at cell phone use, interaction with others, interaction with in-vehicle features other than cell phones, and all other types of driver distraction. In terms of crash severity, we looked at crash severity to determine whether there was a significant difference in distraction impacts across crashes of different severity. So we looked at 3 different levels. Level 1 was crashes involving injury, airbag deployment, rollover, high delta V, or towing. Level 2 were crashes involving a minimum of $1,500 property damage or moderate crash loads. And level 3 were basically the least serious crashes involving physical contact with another object or roadway departure with only minimal or no damage. Next. So what we found was basically distraction causes 29% of all crashes. And the impact of this is $98 billion in economic costs and $395 billion in societal harm. The difference between economic costs and societal harm is the value of lost quality of life, which is determined by the value of statistical life. We use the value that's set officially by the Department of Transportation, which is based on a fairly extensive literature review. Distraction from cell phone use caused 6% of crashes, or roughly 1/5 of all distraction-caused crashes. In terms of severity, we found that risk varied only slightly across the 3 crash severity categories, with central values for each category well within the confidence intervals of the other categories. There was also no trend here. There was no correlation at all between crash severity and the odds ratio. It went up and then it went down. With all this together, we concluded there was not sufficient information to discriminate the impacts of distraction across crashes of different severity, and we applied the 29% to all of our crashes. Next. So I just wanted to mention that we had done a previous study in NHTSA. This was conducted by Mark Minat and Greg Raja in 2015, and they found that police reported distraction rates understated distraction by a factor of 2.5 compared to the more in-depth review of NIMVIX cases that they did. That's the National Motor Vehicle Crash Causation Survey. And for the data that they examined, for the sample they examined, they found distraction in 28% of the crashes in the sample they examined. So the significance of this, just to note, is that we had 2 studies using completely different methodologies, reaching the very same, almost exactly the same conclusion. Next. So there's some caveats about these studies, those 2 studies I mentioned. First, both studies are based on older on-road vehicle fleets from 2013, even a little further back into maybe 2010. But newer vehicles have more in-vehicle functions for both practical and entertainment purposes. So the newer vehicles that are making their way into the on-road fleet provide more opportunities for distraction. And the second point is that cell phone use is more pervasive today than it was a decade ago. So these 2 points argue for possibly the idea that distraction might be higher in newer vehicles and more recent years than it was at the time that these studies were conducted. Offsetting those two, though, newer vehicles will be equipped with automated crash avoidance technology, such as automatic emergency braking, which will mitigate the impact of distraction. So as the fleet changes over to more modern vehicles, you might find that there are more opportunities for distraction inside the vehicles, but the vehicles themselves may be making the impact of distraction less. They may be preventing accidents that the driver behavior would have otherwise caused. So what this points to, this argues for some form of periodic updating of naturalistic studies. If you look at the vehicle fleet now, or maybe even better, if you looked at it maybe about 3 or 4 years from now, there would be a substantial number of more modern vehicles on the road that include these crash avoidance technologies, but that also have these, there's the TV right in front of your face, right, competing with you for with the windscreen. So if we look at this maybe 4 or 5 years from now, we might find a very different result. But it's difficult to predict what the net impact of it be of these, because these two factors move in opposite directions. One final point, even naturalistic studies can only record observed distraction. Daydreaming is not captured, which implies distraction rates may be even higher than what we find in these naturalistic studies. So, if you have your hands on the wheel and you're looking straight ahead, but your mind is on the Amalfi Coast, for example, you're not going to capture that in a naturalistic study. And that's all I have.
Any questions for us?
I did not see any questions coming for you, Charlie. There are several questions. However, we had to narrow a few of them. And what we'll do with these questions is probably tally them and send them out to the panelists, have them answer them. And when we send out the recording, send out some of the answers to it, because we're getting quite a few questions. I narrowed it down. We have one question here for Robin. Is the standard for most of these studies use phones in cars while actively driving, or does it, like many states, regulations of phones in cars include phone use when at stops? Robin?
Oh, there we go. Can you see me? There we are. So it depends on what you mean by stops. Generally, they're measuring when the vehicle's in traffic, moving in traffic. I know there's been a lot of discussion and debate about phone use at intersections, and certainly in Canada, we've seen more phone use at intersections as people believe they're complying with the law when actually they're not. So with respect to each study, I'd have to go back and look at that. Maybe there's some others on the phone who can field that. But generally, as long as the vehicle's in traffic, whether they're moving or stopped, I think that's what we're looking for when they're asking about distraction.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Robin. And Josh, we have I think we'll take 3 of the several questions came in for you. The first one is, can these smart cameras be combined with the city's existing speed enforcement cameras? What are the obstacles? Well, go ahead and you'll start answering that first one, Josh.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think first it's important to point out that today we're talking about prevalence data and wide-scale studies and kind of the scientific and social good of gathering information that's very important for road safety. And that's separate in that context from enforcement. Given that, there is the potential to use this type of technology for safety enforcement and it has been deployed not in the US, but in some other countries, for example, in Australia, for those purposes.
Okay, thank you. And the next question was, what are the obstacles to smart camera use from the public and government, and how are they commonly addressed?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So thank you for that. I think one thing is that it's a new technology. And so whether you could say, common obstacles or commonly addressed, well, you're developing new methods for this research and new methods for data gathering. So there aren't, for example, to my knowledge, this hasn't been used for any wide-scale studies in the US. But I do think it's important to recognize that this exists in a larger context, in a larger public conversation about, say, information gathering. One thing to keep in mind is that, for the purposes of measuring distracted driving and phone use, you're on a very firm ground from a legal basis. People are driving on a public road and they're in plain sight. So there's no real issues there. And we've consulted with a number of legislators and with legal scholars around that. I think the next question, or the next thing that's important to recognize, is that privacy can be built in and is built into the center of the system. You don't need to know who the drivers are. You don't even necessarily need to look at drivers to determine whether they're holding phones. We don't really care. In order to identify, is that driver holding a phone, you may not even need to see their face. And all data would be and is encrypted, is maintained for very limited use for research and data gathering purposes. And there's an extensive privacy model. For example, if you're collecting data, you may count a distracted driver. You don't even need to save any images. You just say, we recognize that a person passed and was holding a phone, count that as one. So it can be very similar to the same operational process that is already used for roadside and observational studies that are done by people.
Awesome, thank you. And then the final question for you is, are there other applications of these cameras? For example, would these have the resolution to capture lane deviation while detecting potential distracted driving behavior?
So I think, just speaking broadly, there is potential to use cameras to identify other types of dangerous driving behavior. For example, racing, tailgating, potentially even drunk driving. The way that you can identify, say, a drunk driver yourself when you see someone weaving from place to place. Exactly what type of camera you would need and how you would set it up, we haven't done any serious studies of that. But I do think there's some potential. One good rule of thumb is, if you could stand in a position and observe traffic by eye, it can almost certainly be detected by a camera, or better by a camera. So you might think, I don't know exactly what you mean by lane deviation, but you might think of it that way as a rule of thumb. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. We're going to go ahead and jump into the next presentation. If we have time at the back end, we'll take some more questions. Go ahead, Corey, take it away.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Nick. And thank you for everyone for sticking on here. It's a real honor to be a part of this group here and to be a part of the coalition. My name is Corey Wojnarowicz, also known as Corey from NoCell, and we are one of the leading technology companies to combat distracted driving. And our mission is very simple, right? It's to get drivers home safely every night, right? Or at the end of every shift. We want to we're tired of hearing about the horrific stories about, hey, my driver was great. He was my driver of the year for 10 years straight. And he looked down at his phone once and, there was a crash and he T-boned a driver and nobody's life is going to be the same ever again. So We're sort of on the opposite side of the rest of it, where we are in prevention. We're trying to take away the number one distraction in the vehicle, which is the cell phone. And cell phones are an absolute addiction. Nobody's disagreeing with that whatsoever. The other thing, the problem is, and we're learning this as the coalition, is that distracted driving, because of the cell phone, is the number one underreported cause of a crash in the nation, in the world, actually. Right. The solution is to somehow get the technology in the vehicle and on the phone so that we can capture this data and actually, on the other side, prevent it. Right. NoCell Technologies is a company that gives the fleet managers and the commercial safety managers and C-level suite the ability to whitelist apps that they deem necessary for the driver to do their job. So maybe it's a navigation app, or it's an ELD or something that they have to do to do their job, but to physically remove all the other apps. So no more TikTok videos while they're driving, and no more buzzes, beeps, or dings from any of the social media or any of the other apps that are causing distraction. So an Asurion study from 2021, it was remarkable. The average time that people were handling their cell phones or checked their cell phones for messages or whatever was 96 times an hour, which is incredible. And the most tempting apps were, of course, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, and whatever else is the newest, latest, and greatest craze out there. What we found out, and that what we have been finding out continuously, is that these COVID habits did not, when people were sitting on their couches, people are sitting at their desks, or at working remotely, they're checking their phone over and over and over again, and magically it did not go away once they got into the cab. They brought these habits along with them. So the type of information that we pick up, or that we can actually share with the companies that have our product installed, or we can let them know the phone handling, the frequency, location, and the tendencies. And like it or not, the cell phone has become a standard piece of equipment in the cab, right? People use it. They have to use it for their ELD. You have to use it for navigation. If you're a long hauler or something to that nature, you're using it for maybe listening to Audible books or Spotify or something to that nature. So what we do is we try and make sure that the driver is not distracted by the phone by removing the apps. So going into these a little bit more, and our friends at VTTI coined it, technology has gotten us into this mess, and technology is going to have to get us out of this mess, and that's 100% accurate.
You have floor for me.
The data that's collected by the NoCell platform, what we have found out that after having the platform installed and used correctly, over the first 2 weeks, it decreases the phone handling by nearly 70%, which is a huge. I mean, that's what we're trying to do, is get somebody not be distracted by their cell phone. We can also share with the clients that have the NoCell technology platform installed. As soon as a driver picks up their cell phone, the technology drops a pin on the map, so they know exactly where the driver was when they picked up the cell phone, and what time it was, what day it was, the whole works as a date and time stamp. The other data that we are gathering and being able to report to our clients is not only where the phone was handled, but how often the phone was handled, the tendencies. So, how far into their trip did they pick up the phone the first time? How many times do they pick it up per hour? What's the tendencies of the drivers? And this is all data that is able to be aggregated and really, washed out, so that there's no GDPR in compliance with this. But what we're trying to do here, and doing with the coalition is we're trying to figure out how to stop people from picking up their cell phone and to measure when they are so that we can combat that urge for people and the temptation for people to pick up the cell phone and be distracted by it. In future revisions, something that I believe Josh was talking about, we will be able to report if the driver, when they pick up the cell phone, if they're texting or they're scrolling or if they're talking on the phone. So it's just more and more data that we can share, and that the fleets that are using our platform can have in their arsenal. Again, the number one mission is to not have drivers distracted by their cell phone whatsoever. We want to make sure that we play a part in eliminating distracted driving because of the cell phone. We can't do anything about the pets in the cab or cheeseburgers at this time, but we can do something about the cell phone. It's 100% preventable a crash that's occurring right now. It's an epidemic that we have to take action on. It's a today problem, and it requires a today solution. And we know that we're not the silver bullet and end all. It's going to take a team. It's going to take different technologies out there, but this is a safety puzzle, and we believe that we are the proactive piece of this safety puzzle. And we just want to take away that cell phone and the urge of people to not have to hear buzzes, beeps, or dings while the vehicle's in motion, so they're not reaching for the phone, looking down and causing crashes, these horrific crashes that it's like a 27 X ring of influence every time that there's a crash that involves a serious injury or a fatality. So with that, Nick, I will take questions and hand it on back to you.
All right, thank you. Let me bring it up here for a couple other questions that we had that were not addressed earlier. I didn't see any coming specifically to you, Corey, but I'll go ahead and start with a couple that we had came in earlier. How do you work through the potential privacy concerns that may arise from the use of technology like this? And I'm not sure that one was directed maybe to Josh earlier, but anyone can jump in and take that question.
Sure, I can jump in and take some of that. I think it goes a little bit to earlier question. I do think it's important to, place the use of data gathering technologies within a recognition that there's a larger conversation in the public about any type of measurement, any type of new technology. What I'd say about this, again, is that it's important to distinguish what you're trying to use the technology for. Here, it's in the service of better understanding of road safety and gathering important social and scientific data. From a legal standpoint, you're in very clear grounds from that. I do think that there is often a conversation about it, and I think the two important things to communicate are, first, this is an existing problem. Distracted driving is a huge safety issue. We already know and study it using other studies like observational studies, which involve doing essentially the same thing. And then that we've built privacy protections into the center of the system with things like encryption and a privacy model where you really measure and only gather exactly what data you might need. And then knowing that this is for use by researchers and can be, controlled and deleted as soon as it's not needed. I think some of those things are important ways to kind of conduct the conversation when there are questions about this issue.
Okay, and thank you. Another question I see here: have there been any data with regards to enforcement of seatbelt laws as an aside to capturing a driver on using a handheld phone? And that's open to anyone on the panel.
Yeah, I'm not sure any of us would have a good answer for that, Nick.
Okay, yeah, we can address that question when I pull all the questions and try to get some answers and send it out. All right, let's move on. Josh, here are a couple more for you. Do you have a sample image showing nighttime use?
I don't have one in my slide deck. We have conducted extensive studies of nighttime use. It looks similar if you're trying to picture what it might look like. It's the same types of images, but black and white, and that's due to how night vision cameras work.
Okay. Another one here. How often does the data need to be pulled?
That starts to get into, specifics, but you could imagine these things can run in real time. You could have, so there's a number, depending on exactly what the requirements of a given study are, how you want to position things, what you want to study for what length of time. You could imagine several different implementations. If you can mount a camera in a position, you can definitely take care of getting the data back. And that can be either in real time or intermittently.
Yeah. Thank you. Is it possible that the data is sent to the iCloud in real time?
There's definitely the possibility that you can use systems that gather the important information in real time. Yes.
Awesome. Corey, these are a couple that came in for you. Can you speak to the receptivity of companies to the NoCell concept and the types of companies that you work with? Example, types of businesses?
Sure. Thanks. Really, it's any commercial vehicles right now. Anyone that has a name on the door, from sedans, pharmaceutical companies, pharmaceutical reps, up to HVAC companies, work trucks. We're working with several. In fact, we just landed a fleet in northern Texas here, and they do. It's a liquid tanker company. So it really doesn't matter. It's whoever is in a company vehicle or in a vehicle doing company business. Basically, the lawyers are going to go after the company and not the driver, right? So you want to protect yourself. We've had great success. Really, the last 6 to 8 months has been phenomenal with companies that have finally come to the realization that what's the cost of putting it in versus what's the cost of not having it. And then, how many more of these fatality stories are we going to have to listen to, right? So we've had great, right, there's drivers always think that they're doing, we're infringing on their rights or whatever. It doesn't matter if it's a company phone or a personal phone, right? It's all handheld devices in the vehicle under FMCSA, right? It's hands-free, one touch. So, and we can actually detect if a driver has a burner phone or if they have another device in the vehicle. We have an alert. We can actually alert companies if there's a multiple devices in the vehicle. We can alert them if the driver tried to circumvent the system by turning off Bluetooth or killing the app. The fleet manager gets an alert, and then those two are automatically turned back on the phone. So we're in good shape for companies to be able to protect themselves and protect their drivers.
Awesome. Let's stick with the NoCell with you, Corey. For NoCell Technology, if an employee has both a company phone and a personal phone, is there any indication that it helps, or does it push the use to the personal phone?
It's a great question. It really depends on the policy of the company, right? If the company has a policy where you can only have the company phone, then it alerts them that there's another device in the vehicle. They can question the driver, what's your intent with the other device or whatever. So it's really, we give the companies the ability to enforce their cell phone policy or their safety policy and let them, find out what's going on actually in the vehicle at the time. But the companies can actually put the app on, a company phone or a personal phone, so that they can make sure that the driver's not using either one. It's completely up to the company and their policy and how they enforce their policy.
Along with the NoCell again, what prevents drivers from bringing a burner phone along without the app?
Well, it doesn't prevent it whatsoever. I mean, we have to expect adults to be adults at some point in time. But it does give the fleet managers, the management of that fleet or that company, the knowledge that there is another device in the vehicle. So that then, I mean, they have to take it up with, how they're going to. We just provide them with the tool to enforce their policy and all of the data of having whatever handheld devices in the vehicle. I mean, it is an epidemic that is killing people every day. So, I mean, eventually we have to do something about it.
Okay, thank you. This one was addressed to everyone. At Live Undistracted, we are focused on preventing smart phone distracted driving and at the same time training drivers to be hands-free. Are there any federal or state funding programs that we can leverage to get our technology to the market quicker?
If there is, please let us know.
All right, I see that's about, any other comments from any of the panelists on any of these questions? Any of the other panelists wish to chime in? We have a couple minutes left.
I just wanted to say one thing. I appreciate the vice chair making time for this. This is such a huge problem. This coalition led by Robin has been an eye-opener, right? This is a huge problem. It's a today problem that requires a today solution, because every day that we don't do something about it, people actually die. Mothers, brothers, cousins, they all, I mean, it's a real problem. And, hats off to everyone that's put in for this and is putting all these hours into making it go away. We need to eliminate this as soon as possible.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point, Corey. And I mean, one of the interesting things that I find, so one with the coalition is really the cross-section of agencies that are so engaged in this issue and all of the innovative work that's being done. Personally, one of the things I reflect on is looking at the commercial vehicle industry and how quickly companies have adopted new technologies and implemented policies and coached and trained drivers. It's a continual work in progress, but they've, in the grand scheme of things, they've made such changes rather quickly. And companies certainly have embraced the idea, because their exposure is so high on the road with other distracted drivers, that technologies are incredibly valuable to protect them from liability, to Corey's point, from other people not doing what they should on the road. So I think if there's a way to really capitalize and harness the pace at which commercial vehicle drivers have gravitated to this issue and looked at research and worked to implement change and change policy and create a new culture of drivers. I think if that's something we can expand to all employers, there would be tremendous benefits. And I think really the coalition represents those employers, but also those families and communities who are negatively impacted that the vice chairman talked about. And I think that's the reason we all come together to spend time talking about this. And I'm super grateful to the members of the subcommittee who contribute to this and to the coalition members who commented and provided feedback. And I'm really looking forward to the next products coming out of the National Distracted Driving Coalition.
Yes, thank you, Robin, and thank you all. As I say, alone we can do so little. Together we can do so much. And we have to give special thanks to folks like Jennifer Smith and others out there that continually working on the committee. At the NTSB, we will continue to be very intentional about collaborating and working together to really find the solutions and to eliminate distracted driving, because we know that we cannot do this work alone. We're at the closing now. We have about 2 minutes. And again, I want to thank all of the panelists and you, the participants, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join the webinar today. In closing, I want to congratulate our panelists and all those who work on this report, on this excellent beginning. The data collected here, the data gaps identified, and this report proactive approach to Technologically addressing these gaps will all help us to fight the battle against distracted driving. We'll continue to fight, we'll continue to work, and I encourage all of you, the advocates out there, and all of you that are on the call, continue to collaborate. They say all advocacy is local, and you can get in your local community, your local jobs, wherever it at, and continue to do the work to eliminate distracted driving. Thank you again. Thanks to the panelists. Have a great day.